I will hand to our first speaker, who's Neil Lawson, who's the director of Compass, which is an organisation similarly concerned with building consensus around progressive policy, similarly, but I would say much better, at organising and congregating a huge range of voices to try and build that democratic power. So I can't think of anyone better to start this than Neil.
Thank you, Will. And thank you to Autonomy, which is a great organisation, which is doing really sterling work, not just public facing, but behind the scenes in terms of its data work and its kind of support for the movement. And I think it's a great organisation. I also can't think of someone, I don't know the name of anyone, as determined as Will Strong. I mean, your parents deserve a medal, I think, for coming up with the name of Will Strong. It's so inspiring and unstoppable. And we're not going to lose while Will Strong is on our side. So well done, Will's parents. Look, we come together at the moment of a twin kind of crisis. The sort of external crisis of climate and capital. Which are cascading around chaotically, and going to continue to do that clearly. But the other side of the crisis is the political crisis, the crisis of the left, the crisis of social democracy, not just here in the UK, but everywhere. There are virtually no places you can point to around the globe at the moment where the left, however you want to describe the left, is aggressively, purposefully, systematically on the front foot, transforming, right? So that double bind is the context in which Autonomy are launching Forum 2029. And I think already my thought for Will and the team is to rename it, because I think this has got to become really political. In the context of those twin crises, it's got to become really, really political. And it shouldn't be Forum 2029. It should be Project 2029. And we should take inspiration from the Heritage Foundation in America and the absolute kind of ambition and determination of those people, not just to have a few nice policies around housing or, whatever else, but to completely remake their economy, their society, and their culture in their image. So why don't we have that sense of ambition and determination to do something very, very different? We had a little bash at the weekend, Compass, and Andy Byrne was talking about the popular left. And I think it's that kind of spirit that we need to put in place. I know we're going to talk a bit about housing, but I was reading a book, I can't remember the name of the author, but a book called Masters, which is all about the rise of the neoliberal right. And there's a bit where they just talk about the event of the 25-year mortgage, and what the 25-year mortgage does to people. It kind of stops them being revolutionary subjects. It kind of binds them into the system. You're not going to revolt if you're on a 25-year mortgage, right? You're going to kind of pay your dues, do your job and behave yourself. Well, what's our kind of versions of 25-year mortgage? Not just political in the sense that we build alternative organizations, but things that really get under the skin of people's kind of nature and culture, which to make them not just kind of, bought into a kind of radical politics, but it seeps into their skin and their DNA and supports them to become more political in their lives. So we've got, Anna at the front, a brilliant proponent of universal basic services, which is part of that. Me and Will are a bit more friendly towards UBI. We can have that fight after in the pub. But these are things. We've got the 4-day week, obviously we've got social housing. But even more political than that, how do we support co-ops and alternative media and also, build up the trade unions? Things that actually make people politically powerful, give them a sense of urgency and buy them in to a different kind of system. Mrs. Thatcher, of course, said the economy is the means, the goal is to change the soul. That's how we should think, right? To bring out, Thatcher knew that in all of us was socialism. And she wanted to destroy it through the institutions she built. Well, how do we have that sense of ambition through Forum, now renamed Project? Sorry, I've renamed it. It's too late. Well, it's all over. Project 2029. How do we have that kind of attitude, that kind of systemic, ambition to do so much more. Because I think, the positive for me at the moment, and I don't know how this kind of feels in the room, but when I go around to different progressive organizations, there is definitely a dawning realization of what we would call systems consciousness. That whatever it is that any of you want in this room, whatever you kind of champion, that actually you're not going to get it in the current democratic and political and economic system. It's not going to happen. So you have to develop that view that our systemic economy has to change. And in order to change that, you've got to change the democratic system, because the economy won't change unless we move towards a more participatory, powerful democratic system as well. And I think that's moving a lot of people in a different direction. So I think we've got to think big and ambitiously about Project 2029. I think we've got to think about how we do politics, about leadership, and what kind of leadership, is going to work in these circumstances. What kind of vision of a good society and a good life do we have? How do we build alliances for change? How do we move out of that kind of, silos, logos, egos, and halos, politics into something which is going to bring people together behind the kind of agenda and project that Will and others are going to be beginning to put together? How do we not just think about influence? I'm old. I'm fed up of banging my head against the door of politicians who don't really want to do what we need them to do, because instinctively and in terms of their incentive, they have no interest in doing it. Well, let's get rid of those people and put other people in place who instinctively do want to do the things that our planet, our society, and our communities need. That means we have to get political and not just think about influence, but think about real power. Within all of that, just to finish, Will, the context in which we're operating. Clearly, we've got a different government, a government that's doing some good things along the way, but doesn't have any of that transformative capability, capacity, or frankly, interest, I don't think. Doesn't mean to say we can't push them to do a bit better, but they're not there. There will be a reset at some stage. That reset could be a lot worse, or it could be a lot better. Much of that is down to us and the context and the influence and the power that we exert. I think it's quite clear that they are moving towards, an election in 2029, which just sets up a binary between, do you want Prime Minister Starmer or do you want Prime Minister Farage? And it will be the politics of the least bad option. And it could backfire electorate at that election. Who knows? It depends on whether they can coerce and squeeze enough people into that, holding their nose because it all smells very badly, to vote for the least bad option. Even if that works at that election, you're just deepening the despair, the resentment, the disillusionment with politics. And you're going to end up with some terrible cleavage, which lurches us to the far right. So I think the stakes are incredibly high. This project could not be more important. And the work that all of you do cannot be more important. So I think that, to finish, Will, your ideas are going to matter. Make them as ambitious as possible. Make them as purposeful as possible. Everyone in the room, including Compass and everyone else, will work with you and support you in that job. But I would say that ideas are absolutely necessary, but they are insufficient. At the end of the day, the victory of ideas needs organising. And so we need to do the ideas and we need to do the organising if we're going to get the world we want. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick correction that we are also into UBS as well as UBI. So we do. If you want to pick up a pamphlet, there's a nice public luxury pamphlet, Universal Basic Services as well. So just don't want to annoy out anything. We do appreciate Universal Basic Services. I will pass to Sarah Nakibeli, who is a deputy director at the Commonwealth think tank, which is in many ways, if autonomy kind of cut its teeth thinking about the future of work, then Commonwealth had a nice counterpart, which is thinking about the future of ownership, which is fundamental to the circuitry of our economy. So, really looking forward to this thing.
Great. Thank you so much. So thank you for having me. I'm going to concede it. So, I think there's going to be I suspect there's some variations on the theme here. And I very much agree with a lot of what Neil said. I think We are living through this moment of profound political realignment. We're seeing the electoral map redrawn, traditional loyalties have fractured, public trust in politics and public institutions just continues to erode. But kind of beneath all of that change and chaos, the signals from the electorate have been remarkably consistent. People want substantial change that's going to improve the material realities of their lives. And, people have noticed 81% of Britons say that the government is badly managing the cost of living, which is roughly as many as said the same after Liz Truss's mini budget in September 2022. And I think it speaks to, this current government came to power promising transformation. And in some cases, the renationalization of rail, we've seen welcome steps towards that. But we've also seen a lot more of the same. So the ongoing privatization and financialization of essential services and kind of the lead ideologically by market logics rather than an imperative of social good. But BlackRock is not going to rebuild Britain. We can't have these essential services in the hands of asset managers and institutional investors. So how did we used to do things? We used to build things. We used to be very good at it. Council housing, which I'm sure Beth and Zach will talk about much more and know much more than I do. But there were times in the past where we built up to 300,000 homes per year. With social housing being a much larger component of building targets, we built the energy and water infrastructure that we have today, health services, etc. But after the privatization of one key sector after another, we allowed private companies to strip our infrastructure assets, which were all originally built with public funds, and to do so for profit. And this has led to chronic underinvestment while dismantling supply chains, pushing people into low-paid and insecure work, and extracting wealth from bill payers to benefit shareholders, executives, and big financial institutions. And evidence of how this privatization has failed is quite damning. Let me throw some statistics at you. In water, £78 billion has been handed to shareholders since it was privatized in 1989. £64 billion in new debt, and yet not one reservoir has been built in England and Wales since that time. And what this has meant for people is that 35% of customer bills are now going towards just paying off the interest on that debt and further dividends to shareholders. All the while we can't safely swim in our rivers or seas, as water companies continue to dump raw sewage with very minimal repercussions. In energy giants have pocketed over £500 billion in profits since the energy crisis, as ordinary households continue to be hammered by high bills. In transport, bus fares have doubled since privatization, while half of routes have been scrapped since 2010. And in rail, from the 2016 to 2024 period, train operating companies paid out more in dividends than the £1.9 billion that they made in post-tax profits which they were only able to make thanks to a cumulative $28 billion in public subsidies. And last year, the rolling stock companies, which are the companies that own and lease out the actual train carriages themselves, have seen their profits triple. So the system is manifestly failing. Privatization follows the same systematic pattern over and over again. It discourages investments as companies prioritize shareholder payouts and sweating these assets. It fragments and slices up sectors, making all the systems that we need across transport and health and care and all these different things, making essential services less coherent and less effective. It creates bureaucratic complexity. If you're going to have private industries like this, you need to have regulators. There will always be this kind of antagonistic relationship between the regulator and the industry as regulators try and fail to rein in private utilities. It erodes public trust. The public we have all seen this. We've seen our bills go up and up and up and services deteriorate year after year. And it increases debt and financial fragility just sort of across the board as companies over-leverage in order to reward their investors rather than actually investing in improving and building new infrastructure. And so we have this moment now, which is both a danger and an opportunity. The danger is that continued disappointment with mainstream politics creates space for reactionary alternatives. We've already seen this in the UK, we've seen it across Europe, and obviously in the US. But there's also extraordinary opportunity as these traditional alignments are breaking down, and this also creates space for new coalitions and approaches. We can't let the far right have a monopoly on getting into this wedge. The question is really about whether progressive forces can articulate a vision that's going to match the scale of the public's ambition for change. We have an opportunity now to really build strong public services run by democratic institutions for social benefit, and in doing so, rebuild public trust in those institutions. And we should organize this vision around a simple principle, ensuring that everyone can access life's essentials on fair terms. This means moving beyond incremental reforms, tinkering around the margins, and towards strategic, large-scale decommodification, removing key goods and services from market logics, which will always place profit above anything else, and placing them under democratic control and run towards social good. I've included my policy proposal here, so I'll just work it in.
Just to be clear to everyone, I let Neil not do this because he ran out of on, but I did ask every panel member to come up with one policy, because it's my fault. I forgot that actually at the end of this whole series, Autonomy going to be writing about the kind of what a policy program would look like condensed from the discussion, basically. So thanks, Sophia.
My one policy is sort of a sneaky two policies.
It's qualified if we did it.
Commonwealth would propose that we should take back into public ownership energy and water. And why these sectors specifically? These are natural monopolies where consumers have little or no choice. I'm sure a lot of you have Thames Water as your water provider, as do I. I have absolutely no other option. It's just the market failure is crystal clear. Competition doesn't exist, and private ownership has demonstrably failed to deliver any positive or efficient outcomes for decades. These are significant household expenditures and also a major source of household financial stress. This is about whether people can keep their homes. And also, particularly for water, the UK is already an anomaly. 90% of water services around the world are publicly owned. We're quite an outlier in this regard. And both of these ideas are already really popular. 71% of people support public energy ownership and 82% support public water ownership. I can get more into the details about how we would do that, but I can also just skip forward. If anyone wants to ask me about the details, I've got a whole thing prepared. But basically, there's very kind of not easy, but there are clear ways that we can do this renationalization. We can do it through special administration, which is this kind of existing legal framework that would allow us to take particularly the water companies back into public ownership due to their failures to meet their statutory duties, which are basically not to pollute rivers and seas. And with energy, we would specifically want to bring the national grid and distribution networks into public ownership, because these are, again, natural monopolies, and expand Great British Energy and to a more ambitious, large public developer like they have in France with EDF. And, we would really need to, as well, accept public ownership as a panacea. It's not going to fix every single problem. It's going to require consistent and effective governance and investment in order to rebuild these institutions, as well as the public trust that we need to run them effectively. But we think this is strategic. It's going to address the most visible market failures. It's going to create a foundation for broader transformation. The hope is that success in nationalizing these utilities will demonstrate that democratic ownership can outperform private ownership and build confidence for more ambitious reforms elsewhere. And we can already see political coalitions forming around different constituencies. This could bring together climate activists, workers, bill payers, etc., and unite these different groups around bringing tangible improvements to daily life. Railway renationalization is a great test case. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to show that public transport will work better in public hands. But if that renationalization is going to amount to little more than changing the logo, and customers don't actually see lower ticket prices, improved services, carriages that are maintained, et cetera, this opportunity really risks being wasted. And the far right, as well as corporate interests, will undoubtedly capitalize. And so the foundation for this work already exists. We have strong public attitudes towards privatized utilities. We have growing climate consciousness among the public. And we, most importantly, have widespread frustration with the current economic settlement. So the task of progressive politics is to channel this dissatisfaction into concrete policy alternatives that can command broad political support. And we also need to move beyond diagnosing what's wrong with the current system, as much as critique is helpful, but we need to move towards developing practical alternatives that can form the basis for the next phase of progressive politics in Britain. We can take back control of these essential services from profiteer companies, and build a more secure and sustainable economy and end the rip-off once and for all.
Make a paraphrase of a statement that people make about basic income. Public ownership, correct me if I'm wrong here if you think otherwise, but public ownership won't solve every problem, but it will make solving every other problem much easier. So I think that's a good summary of what you're saying. There is, I think, the event straight after this one is, so in like 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, is on food, water, energy with 5 Lewis and a few others. So if you want to hear more about that conversation, I have a feeling that public ownership is going to feature a lot of the Forum 2029 event. So thanks, Sarah. We'll pass straight to Danis Schuskandaraja, who is the CEO of the New Economic Foundations. If you're familiar with the progressive think tank space, you'll definitely know Neff's work, putting out fantastic papers every month. I'll jump straight to Danny, I think, instead of that. Thanks, Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Will. Hi, everyone. I think I'm going to say the same things as you guys, but hopefully slightly differently. And I'm really only going to say one thing, which is our job, all of us in this room, and if you happen to be watching, is to show that another world is possible. And in the last few months in particular, I've just been in a particularly reflective mode because I've been trying to think about sort of my own career and the assumptions I've held within it. I've been thinking about arriving at Neff, where I started only just over a year ago, and thinking about what's the New Economics Foundation's role in the world. And also doing some soul searching, as I suspect lots of us in this room have been, about the state of the sort of progressive politics and progressive forces we seem to be losing. All of those processes bring me to the same conclusion, which is our job is to show that another world is possible. So on the personal bit, I did my PhD 20 odd years ago and joined IVPR, the progressive think tank, during the Blair Brown years, and have spent most of my career thinking that actually a little bit of incremental change to our political system, to our economic system, will deliver the world we want. Right? That's a sort of the social democratic wet dream in some ways, right? That somehow we've arrived. It's the end of history. We've developed a sort of liberal democracy that's going to give voice and sufficient participation to every one of us. And we've developed a sort of economic system that's going to benefit enough people, and it was sort of delivering for more and more. And it would be, that's it. So economically and politically, we've done enough. And all of our job was to make it just a bit better, particularly at the margins. And I think what we're seeing is that was incredibly naive and probably incredibly dangerous, because that's not what's happening. We've got a political system that seems to be marginalizing more and more people who, as both Neil and Sarah have said, through their disaffection and anger at the system, are reaching for ever more radical, populist, extremist political solutions. We've got an economic system that we were told was benefiting everyone. We were going to lift people out of poverty through a trickle-down system. And yes, in some ways, in some aggregate measures, we were doing that. But last year, I think, was the first year in recorded history where every country in the world saw a rise in income inequality. And data is far from perfect, but wealth inequality increased even more extremely. And so we've got an economic system that is making us more unequal, more insecure. And of course, I suspect Zach and others will talk about this, what that economic system is doing to the planet, to nature, to the ecosystem that we are part of, is incredibly dangerous. And so I think I'm coming perhaps a bit too late to the conclusion of my own working career that our job is to show that another world is possible. And in some ways, with colleagues at the New Economics Foundation, we're also reaching a similar conclusion. So the role of the think tank traditionally has been to sort of create the evidence base so that policymakers make slightly better decisions, that we can just gather the evidence and convince the right people, get the reports into the right hands, and, good things will happen. And that model also seems to be incredibly broken because people don't trust evidence, they don't even care about the evidence, and it's a sort of dangerous pastime to think that a bit of wonkery is going to deliver the world we want. And so I think with colleagues at NEF, where we've been doing a sort of strategy refresh, we've come to the conclusion that our job is to show that another world is possible, that we can deliver a fundamentally different political and economic system. And in some ways, Will, the reason I am delighted to be here is I think I have huge kudos to you and colleagues at the Autonomy Institute, because in some ways the work that you've been doing around the nature of work and not tolerating the assumptions we've been told to make about what work should be like, or this work about thinking about UBS as public luxury, completely reframing how we might think of the services that we should have a right to or should be entitled to, is exactly the sort of thing that we all should be doing. Just a few prompts for discussion later, and then one policy idea related to housing to finish off with. So in terms of, what might that look like? For me, one of the exciting bits that colleagues at NEF are working on is around extreme wealth. Try to identify the point at which that someone holding a particular amount of wealth, a household or an individual, is dangerous, right? When does wealth become extreme or dangerous? And surely there is a point, right? Because at some point you can have so much wealth that you can buy political influence through party donations or giving the prime minister freebies or whatever it is you do. At some point, the consumption habits of the super wealthy are also incredibly dangerous, because we know that these are ultra frequent flyers. Their consumption habits are dangerous. We also know that wealth, when highly concentrated, is incredibly damaging to capitalism as we know it, because really wealthy people don't tend to put their investments and their money into productive, job creating, happiness generating activities. They tend to hoard their assets, look for short-term returns, and sort of become rentiers. So in all of these ways, there's a point at which we think that wealth is dangerous. So if you agree that there's a point at which wealth can become dangerous, well, what is that point? And so we've been asking lots of people. We've been asking rich people themselves. We did a survey along with Patriotic Millionaires, a brilliant organization of rich people who want to be taxed more. And we've asked them, it turns out a survey of several thousand millionaires, people with more than $1 million worth of net disposable assets in 20 countries, whether they think there's a point at which wealth becomes dangerous. Turns out about 2/3 of them think that it's about $100 million. Just under a half think that it's about $10 million. So even rich people think there's a point at which that wealth is there. So to me, here's a hint of a way of reframing even wealth in our society. Why wouldn't we, as a civilized species, have an extreme wealth line? So say that just as we have an extreme poverty line, below which we think no one in our society should have to live, why wouldn't we have an extreme wealth line that says, actually, that in order to live in a fair and sustainable society, we shouldn't prevent accumulation at extreme levels, and that's what it is. So here's an example of just thinking about, I think, a very, very different way that we might organize or discipline our society. Completely differently, I read with great interest the promise in the Labour Party manifesto that the House of Lords will be abolished. Turns out there hasn't been a huge amount of progress on that. I think we might, sometime during the course of the Parliament, have the 91 hereditary peers in our unelected upper house, the world's second biggest chamber, 7% of members of which are party donors and former party officials. We call ourselves a mature democracy, yet we tolerate this. Why wouldn't we replace that unelected chamber with a house of the people? Let's say through sortition, select people representative of the British population and appoint them for, say, a term of 2 or 3 years and treat it much like jury service, that it's an obligation as a citizen to go in. Your job is protected. You're paid a stipend. And your job, or the group of these people, would be will serve as a house of review, that we would look at when the lower house, the House of Commons, has a particularly contentious decision to make on assisted dying or Brexit, those sorts of decisions, instead of making it a sort of about party politics and what our elected representatives think, why couldn't we have a more participatory or deliberative form of making a decision? And to me, it's, again, a powerfully simple way of reimagining the way that our democracy works, to make it sort of deliberately more participatory. And so, those are two very sort of simple ideas that are examples in my head of thinking about the world and showing that another world is possible. And I think unless we do that in 2029 or in elections beyond that, it's going to be incredibly difficult for anyone who calls himself a progressive to muster support, because for me the problem we find ourselves in politically is so much of the center of politics is stuck with a model that's completely unsustainable politically, economically, and environmentally. And so our job is to show that another world is possible. On the policy idea, I know Beth and Zach are going to talk about housing, but NEF is proud to be a member of an alliance called the Homes for Us Alliance. And it's about 20 or so different organizations that have come together to campaign for better, fairer, and more accessible housing. And the ask that we have is that the government to use the devolution bill, which is going to go through Parliament soon, to give mayors in particular or local authorities the right to enforce rent controls. But it's that sort of relatively practical thing that will make lives much better for many more people, but importantly, show that another world is possible.
Well, thank you. I think we also responded in that the democratic reform piece actually is super interesting, and we do have one of the in-person events here will be in July. That's going to be on media tech and democratic reform. So if you're interested in that conversation, do come to that. But I think that's an interesting one that we'll definitely consider for the program. Beth Stratford is a fellow at IIPP, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and the co-founder of the London Renters Union. I would just watch that speaker because I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. So if everyone hears that, just put your hand up just to, if it's annoying it, then maybe Beth can move forward. So give it a shot. Thanks, Beth.
Okay. Try and find myself. Will has threatened me with very ruthless cutting off if I go over time. So yeah, it's convenient. There's going to be 3 of us backing rent controls. But before I get to my pitch, I'm going to give you a bit of a kind of a wider context of why the housing system is so fundamentally broken. Because there actually is no silver bullet. So rent controls are not going to do it. Look. But it doesn't work. Okay, could somebody by any chance sit next to that laptop and press the forward button when I give you a little wink?
Yeah.
This one here. Okay, so the main message that I really want to get across is that the idea that the speculative market-led construction system is going to solve the housing crisis is a recipe for total failure. Successive governments have pledged to solve the housing crisis in this format, and the current government has this pledge to build 300,000 homes every year. This Parliament, it's not going to work. I mean, it's not going to work because most housing experts will tell you we won't. It's not feasible. We don't have the skills and construction capacity to meet that goal. But even if we did, there are fundamental problems with this system. So the way that the land market works in the first place, for those who don't know, developers will when they're deciding how much to bid for a piece of land, they'll think, okay, how many homes? It's called the speculative model. I'm not just being kind of rude. That's literally the official term for it, because they will make a speculative assumption about how many homes they can build on the land, how much money they will be able to charge for those homes when they sell them. And that's the sort of top level. And then they'll subtract from that how much they think they're going to spend on build quality and the actual building cost. and how much they're going to contribute in terms of infrastructure and social homes. So you can already see that it's the developers who are most willing to constrain and cut corners on the standards and quality of the building, and who are most bullish and confident about wriggling out of their responsibilities on social housing and infrastructure contributions. They will win the bid. They will bid the largest amount of money for the land, and the whole system pushes up land prices. The only winners in this situation really are landowners. And multiple government reviews, including the Competition Markets Authority, have pointed out that the model there's a lot of risk involved in this model. So not all developers are evil, but they have a kind of built-in structural incentive to maintain the price of homes that they are ultimately going to sell, because if they then flooded the market with new homes and the price of homes dropped in the local area, their profit margins would suffer. So they're not going to do that. So that's the first point. And I'm already behind time. This works. Okay. And also the data shows us that new supply has a very limited impact on rents. I won't go into detail on this graph, but basically the relationship between new supply and rents is there, but it's pretty weak. And I've calculated that even if the government achieves its 1.5 million homes a year plan, the rent to wage ratio will fall by just 1 percentage point, which is not going to cut it when you consider the fact that the poorest renters are paying nearly 60% of their household income on rent. The relationship between new supply and house prices is even weaker based on the government's own models for house price sensitivity. So this modelling by Ian Mulhern shows that even if we built 300,000 homes every year for the last 3 decades, house prices will only be 7% cheaper by now. And so it's true that market prices rise when demand increases faster than supply, but what's frequently misunderstood is what is supply and what is demand. Supply isn't just the number of homes that are being built. The vast majority of supply comes from homes recirculating, but coming back onto the market to be sold, existing homes. And the rate of recirculation has dropped enormously since the 80s, and there's a reason for that. Certain sections of the population are occupying second homes, larger homes than they need. We've got demographic changes. I'll go into that. But this is a big driver of the fall in supply. And on the demand side, demand is not just the number of people who need somewhere to live, right? Demand is made up of all buyers in the market, including lots of second home buyers and investors, the purchasing power that people have available to them, which has also been inflated, and the preference that people have for winning that bid. So the consequence of both of those factors is that we're seeing an increasingly unequal distribution of housing space. It might surprise some of you to know that we have 20% more housing space per person than we did in the mid-90s. Also more homes per person than ever before, more bedrooms per person than ever before. I'm going to qualify that by saying that I'm not in the camp of people who think that we have no shortage of homes compared to the number of households. But we do have more housing space than ever before. The problem is that it's distributed badly and it's not divided into enough units of the size that's suitable and matches the needs of the population. And so actually you can see here that the number of households who have more than 2 spare bedrooms is well over 35% of households. That completely dwarfs the proportion of households who are in overcrowded accommodation or who are under-occupying. And actually surveys show that about a third of those under-occupied homes would be amenable to downsizing. So what's kind of driven that desire? We do know is that a 10% increase in income leads to a 20% increase in consumption of housing space. So why is it that the more people earn, the more they decide to consume of housing space? Well, a big part of a big factor driving that is the increasing treatment of homes as financial assets. This is just one piece of evidence, which is that the proportion of homes bought as additional dwellings rose from about 15 to 45% between 2016 and 2023. Massive prospect of capital gains, massive failures of the tax system to discourage that speculative treatment of homes. Then we, of course, have the purchasing power available to buyers in the market has exploded because of the deregulation of the mortgage market. Most people, when they're buying a home, don't rely on existing savings. They go and borrow money from the bank. So if it becomes easier and cheaper to borrow money from the bank, then of course the purchasing power, the money being pushed into the housing market expands, which is exactly what we saw happen. In the decades leading up to the financial crisis, mortgage credit tripled from 20% to 60% of GDP. And buy-to-let have played a really big role in the affordability crisis, not only because demand from landlords pushed up house prices, but also that demand trapped then many, many millions of more people in the private rented sector, which is obviously the least affordable and worst quality of all the tenures. And what incentivized that demand? It's going to be obvious, tax breaks, buy-to-let mortgages, but also rising rental yields. And this is where this graphic, I think, is really, really important, because what it shows, where did we see the fastest deterioration of rents? It happened, surprise, surprise, immediately after the introduction of the Thatcher's two housing acts, 1980 and 1988, which introduced right to buy and then deregulated rents. And that was when we saw this extraordinary deterioration in affordability, and then immediately in the aftermath of that, a doubling of the size of the private rented sector. And it looks from that graph like the rent to income ratio has been more or less stable. What's really happened there is that rents have been pushed to the absolute maximum that tenants can bear. And the way that now money is being sucked out is by tenants occupying a smaller and smaller space. So they may look like a stable ratio, but they're occupying less space over time. And of course, the other big factor here is the shift in government policy away from subsidizing supply to subsidizing demand, both through housing benefit and help to buy. So those are both, helping people to put money into the market that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do, which there's evidence has inflated prices further, both rent prices and house prices. And the big, extraordinary shift that we see is illustrated here. So in the 70s, about 95% of government house expenditure was on building or improving homes. Now only 12% of that expenditure is on building homes. The vast majority is spent on housing benefit. So what I tried to do there is kind of race through problems on both the supply side and the demand side of the housing system. And I'm still within time. I won't run through that all again, but all of that is sort of preamble to say that we need really, really fundamental reform of the housing system in order to solve this crisis. And sort of hoping and expecting that sort of profit-led development is going to cut it is not going to work. And I'd make a pitch for rent controls among a whole bundle of different policies. And I can talk about the policies that would need to come alongside rent controls to make sure that rent controls work well, because they won't work well on their own. And that's, we have to be clear about that. But I think that I'm quite optimistic, actually, about us winning rent controls, because it's one of the few policies that will save government money, save government massive amounts of money. I've been doing an analysis of how different models of rent control will impact poverty levels, the number of children we can pull out of poverty, the amount of billions we can save in housing benefit. I've been looking at landlord profit margins, how many tenancies become unprofitable, and how much money we can save. So if you kind of look at I can't give you those figures because I'm publishing with a report with NEF, so I'll be in trouble with my funders if I give away, let the cat out of the bag. But I'm just going to say, if you look at the amount of money it would cost to buy outright all of the homes that become unprofitable under certain models of rent control, and you compare that to the amount of money we can save in housing benefit over a 10-year period, they compare very favorably, is what I'm going to say. And so this idea that, there's nothing, what's going to happen? Landlords are going to sell. Well, actually, good, because we want the private rented sector to shrink. We want that. Nobody wants to live in the private rented sector. We have to manage that process very carefully. It's essential that we don't have an evictions crisis on our hands. Like we talk about how you manage that process, but we do have levers at our disposal to make sure those homes don't disappear when they're sold. We can make sure that they transfer into social ownership, cooperative ownership, or even just be bought by tenants. Any of those options is obviously better than staying in an unregulated private rental sector. Thanks.
Thanks. And I'll ask you, but by no means least, is Zach Polanski, who's London Assembly member, deputy leader of the Green Party, and leadership candidate of the Green Party in England and Wales. Very happy to have Zach, please.
Thanks, everyone. To say the obvious, it's been great. Thank you all. I'm going to talk about housing, but I want to zoom out first, and it's largely actually a response to everything I've just heard. I was asked recently in an interview where I spent an hour kind of talking about how bad everything is, and then someone said, what does good look like? Which is a very obvious question. But their kind of frame was that the right used to talk about nostalgia. It used to be take back control, looking at history. But they're moving to this weirder phase now, particularly through Elon Musk, which is about space travel and artificial intelligence. And it's more future looking. And they said, what is the left's answer to that? What is the left's kind of future that doesn't sound like we're trying to revisit past histories, but actually we're looking what a different society looks like. And I think we've heard a lot of it today, which is where things are in public ownership, where we don't have such a bad housing crisis that public money is going straight into private capital because we're funding private landlords through benefits. It looks like where we have more compassion. We were told that we were going to work less hours, have more money. I know that's not most people's experience. In fact, it's quite the opposite. And then just a few days later, by coincidence, I met Will and the Autonomy team at City Hall where we were having a meeting. I can't even remember what it was about. It was about something specific. But within about 20 minutes, we covered pretty much every topic possibly, because everything is everything and everything connects to everything. And you can't have environmental justice without racial, social, and economic justice. And I think this is coming out through everything that everyone's saying. You can talk about housing, but it connects to the inequality in our society. It connects to, is the home properly insulated? Is that good for the environment? It connects to if your home isn't properly insulated and you're cold in the winter and you're too hot in the summer and your bills are going up, then that's also penalizing people who are living in poverty already. So I think all of these conversations connect. And one of the most obvious examples I can think of isn't that well known, but I'm working hard to make it more well known. So in 2012, there was a flood on the River Thames in Surrey. And there was a young boy called Zayn. He was 8 years old. And the flood hit a landfill site that was near his home. Now, the people living in the home have been complaining about this landfill site for 4 years. And it does remind me of the same power dynamic as the Grenfell Tower and so many other issues where poorer communities, and particularly people of colour, are saying to authorities, there is a problem here, something's going to happen. And because of the lack of political representation, the problems around power, wealth and status in our society, where people too often aren't listened to or they're not politically represented, they are ignored in favour of property developers or people who own wealth and power. And so they're ignored. There was a flood in this landfill site that released hydrogen cyanide, and Zayn was killed at 8 years old. His father was paralysed and is still in a wheelchair to this day. He is going around the country talking about what happened and trying to lift up the status of what is known as Zayn's Law. And Zayn's Law, at the heart of it, is so simple. It's just saying that if you have a contaminated land site, then the local authority should know about it. If a property developer knows that the land is dangerous and needs remediating, then they should talk about that openly. But again, the power of the property developers, the power of power and wealth, means that far too often this doesn't happen and we are completely lacking in transparency. And so when I started to talk about Zayn's Law in the national media, people started to contact me all over the country, but particularly here in London, just Hackney round the corner, where I met some residents of a social housing estate who were saying there is property developments happening as close as I am to this TV screen. So there's a bit of a gap between where the infill is happening. But what we're breathing in is giving us itchy eyes, it's giving us breathing problems, there's noise, there's smoke, all of these things are happening. And then when they complained about it, the property developer hired their own company to come in and assess the air, which takes so long that they said, we're not going to stop building it until we've got the evidence of what's happening. By that time, the building has continued. When the results came in, the air wasn't an acceptable quality. And so then they paused building. This independent company that the private property developer hired then said, here's the mitigations you need to make. They clearly weren't good enough. And then building started again, but they didn't have to get the evidence straight away to check that the mitigations were working. So they bought themselves another few months while they got the evidence in. Now, I know this is very specific, but I think it speaks to the inequality that lies in so many of our decisions, where property developers, the same ones who are donating to the same two old parties, both the previous government and the new government, that are making these decisions, yet are receiving money from these same property developers who it is very clearly and so obviously in their vested interests to continue this completely broken system, that it's not just destroying people in terms of the affordability of housing and the lack of actually building council housing. When Angela Rayner says they're going to build houses, great, but they're not stipulating how many are council houses and social houses. So you might as well just be saying, we're going to throw a lot of money and inflate an exacerbated system that isn't serving people already, where buildings are not homes, they are just assets, as we've just been hearing. And is not going to solve the problem in and of itself. And so then I come to the kind of the third part of this, is when you complain about this as a progressive politician, no matter what party, or not just a politician, a commentator, the word NIMBY is shouted at you when you talk about the planning and infrastructure bill, because this government have gone to complete war with nature. And notice they pick the bats and newts because they know that the beavers, the hedgehogs, the kind of cute species, the public like them, so they're not daring to go to war with them. But the bats and newts, they've made a calculation that they can both keep the landlords on site and make people shrug, despite the fact that our ecosystems are collapsing. We are one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. We really need nature. And so they blame the bats and newts, which by proxy is blaming the planning system, when we know there are more buildings waiting in the planning system that are sitting on land banking than there are that actually need to be built. And so once again, it is the property developers who are creating the same briefings for ministers and people who are making these decisions and are briefing these to media commentators. So if anyone dares to say, yes, we need buildings, we need homes, that's very clear, but also should we consider nature and how the whole system works, immediately get shouted down as if they are, we hear this builders versus blockers whole narrative. And it is so incredibly corrosive. So that's the big stuff. Then there's the much more obvious specific stuff. There are amazing groups like Inclusion London that are saying, if we're building properties, maybe we could work towards a social model of disability. This is where disabled people's thoughts aren't included, as an afterthought. They're not retrofitted afterwards, but actually from the very beginning, buildings are made to be accessible, because actually that creates a better quality of building anyway. And so I think that's whole, I think Neil used the phrase systems consciousness around recognizing, I know you're using it in a slightly different context, but again, that if you make one poor decision, that cascades throughout the entire system. But I suppose what I'm saying, and it's such an obvious thing to say that partly I go, why am I saying this? But I think it needs saying at every possible moment, that our system is so corrupted by corporate wealth and by very wealthy multimillionaires and billionaires who are again donating to these political campaigns, that we have politicians who are bought and sold for. Now, I'm being careful in what I say, because I think if you erode complete trust and confidence in the entire system, I could be, this is horrible, Donald Trump or Nigel Farage giving this speech. We badly need these institutions. We badly need democracy. We badly need transparency and accountability. But we don't have transparency and accountability. And so these systems are being eroded, which totally serves the right, because then, and we see this with Project 2025, and we see this with what's going on with the Farage project, which is they then point at the same systems that they've worked to destroy through privatization. We see this with the National Health Service, through managed decline, where they go, well, public ownership never worked. Look how bad everything is gone. Despite the fact that on so many things, we don't actually have public ownership. I know we even talked about railways earlier, but they're not nationalising a pretty vital part, which is the trains themselves, the rolling stock. And so there's this kind of, and I agree, let's applaud progress where it happens, but also let's be really clear if progress is sometimes dressed up as something that could make things worse, and then public ownership is what gets blamed. So what is the answer here? Well, I think the answer partly, and I think Danny touched on this in some ways, we talked about populist messages. Now, I want to be careful with this again. Populist messages in the way that Farage does them is certainly not where the progressive movement needs to go. Because let's be clear, they're not populist messages, they're lies, they're misinformation that is spun through a compelling story that feels intuitive to people. And that's incredibly dangerous, and that's the steps to fascism. What I think those of us who are progressive and on the left need to do is to find more powerful stories that are based in science, information, and facts. And that is much harder. And that's exactly why we need Policy 2029 and we need policy intellectual coalitions working together. Because if we just go out and tell powerful stories, then they're not actually rooted in anything, and they will fall apart very quickly as soon as someone asks for evidence and detail, as they should. But if we come from a place of going, we know we have the solutions. We have incredible creative minds who can look at this totally broken system and go, actually, a lot of the time, it's not rocket science. There are things you can do where you co-design with communities. So it's not top down, but actually you bring people in, particularly marginalized communities from the very beginning. You work alongside research scientists, people who are experts in the field, along with lived experience. And then you can create amazing solutions to things. And so that needs to be done. And it also needs to come with a powerful story. So when I talk about populism, I'm talking about the fact that if you care about the food on your table, the heat in your homes, and securing a job if you want a job, then that feels more urgent than the climate crisis. But we also know that the climate crisis is going to make things much worse, particularly for the poorest communities, who are the ones who are struggling the most. But if you come at it from a place which is about climate crisis or GDP, that's a whole other conversation, then that does not connect with people. We know during the Brexit debate, we had that woman shout, that's your GDP. What we do need to connect with is people's material living conditions and the fact things are so hard right now that poor people have got poorer than they've ever been before, rich people have got richer than they've ever been before. We've fundamentally got to tackle that. So what do we do about it? Rent control, spoiler. And to make this a little bit more interesting, and I'll wrap up, shout out to my colleague Zoe Garbutt of the London Assembly, who has been advocating for rent controls for a long time. And then when the Labour government got in, Sadiq Khan said, yeah, I support rent controls, but I need the government to give me permission to do it. So that comes to the devolution point. I'd love to see more powers for city mayors and local authorities. No, that's not more cash. London probably gets enough cash, but actually what we could have is powers to raise our own cash. So a wealth tax, for instance, within London to give more powers and more cash to the mayor to spend on the right things, I think would be interesting. But what Zoe did, and I think is really interesting model for all cities, is say, well, let's have a renters commission that involves bringing people in, like the Runnymede Trust, the Racial Equality Society, ACORN, London Renters Union, lots of other people with a stake in this to say, we know rent controls in and of themselves won't fix things. We also know there are issues with rent controls. And I don't think as progressives, we should just say, yes, this is fine, this is easy. But let's get the people in now to co-design what it looks like and what are the other things we can do where we're not tinkering at the edges, but we're going for systems change. So then the mayor could go to government and go, here's a really fully fleshed out plan that is co-designed with the people most affected. We are asking for this change. And then if the government wants to say no, then the kind of difficulty around transparency and accountability is laid even further bare. But if I'm an optimist, hopefully you go to the government with that plan and they go, this is a great idea. As Beth says, this will save us money. It will fix a huge inequality in our system. And also, if we want a more patriotic society where, you know, they're warmongering right now, but if you're going to be patriotic, you've got to have a society that's worth saving. You've got to have a society that people feel is worth defending and worth wanting to live in. So even, that's not my frame, obviously, but even if that's your frame on the centre right, then it is time to fix this fundamentally broken system. So thanks for having me and let's go save the planet.